Hello, and welcome to everyone to our broadcast on No2Nato. My name is Stott, and I'm with the Workers' Party of Britain. And of course, we've got some great speakers tonight, and the speakers are going to be talking and informing us about defending the indefensible, the EU and Palestine, which is clearly a very, very hot potato at this moment in time. And there's a lot of elements to it that require some specialist knowledge, and of course, leading the way in some of our specialist knowledge is going to be our first guest, a guy called Dr. Philip O'Connor, who's based in Dublin. Good evening, Philip. How are you?
Hello, Michael. Good evening. Delight to be on your show.
Absolutely, and it's great to welcome you. If you'd like to just give us a couple of moments on you just before we start, and then we'll lead you into the first question, if that's okay, Philip.
Okay. Well, I live in Dublin. I've been politically active all my life. I write regularly in the Irish Political Review on Irish politics, on European politics. I've lived in Germany for some years, lectured in some universities, worked at all various jobs, but currently I've been covering these issues in the Irish Political Review.
Well, thanks for that, Philip. And of course, what we'd like to do is start with a question. Since the start of Russia's military operation against Ukraine, the EU has been fully behind Ukraine in a number of ways. Philip, do you feel that the EU's condemnation of Russia has matched that of Israel, and why?
Well, I mean, you're talking about two planetary systems here. They're so far apart. There's just no, and it's one of the moral problems the EU have is that their citizenry are noticing this grotesque divide between their treatment of the two issues. I mean, on Ukraine, even before anything happened in this latest phase, let's be clear that what happened in February 2022 is just the latest phase of a very complicated both civil war and geopolitical conflict that had been going on for 10 years. That even in late 2021, as Ursula von der Leyen later boasted, Europe and the Americans had already agreed on how they were going to deal with Russia through sanctions from hell, I think Biden later called them, that would crush the Russian economy. And there's a lot of American and European commentators gleefully wrote at the time this would lead to the meltdown of the regime and regime change in Moscow. So these are the ambitions that the West went into quite cocksuredly at the start of this latest period. And I mean, and everything Russian was extirpated then from European life. Everything from orchestras were cancelled. Just name it. From day one, any type of media from Russia was banned in the EU airspace and so forth. So it was a very determined and pre-prepared series of measures taken. On the other hand, Europe has a trade relationship with Israel, which is called the EU-Israel Association Agreement, under which trade is regulated between the two states. And Article 2 of that agreement makes the agreement subject to both sides, behaving in compliance with international law, humanitarian law, human rights, or so forth. And it was one of the amazing things that stuck out for me from a statement last week by the UK, France, and Canada, was that Israel's behaviour carried with it the danger that it could breach international humanitarian law. This is just in the last week, as if that hasn't been the case for indeed many decades.
Yeah.
So it's kid gloves for Israel, and it's as regards Ukraine, it's been as even I think one of Trump's people, was it Rubio? Probably not Rubio. It's one of them anyway, who admitted last week that this has been a proxy war against Russia by forces of NATO.
Thanks for that, Philip. That's fantastic. Thank you. So let's now meet our second guest, Peter Ford, who is the former British ambassador to Syria and also the Workers' Party of Britain deputy leader. It's a great honour to have you on the programme tonight, Peter. And can I ask you just to, if there's anything that you want to say about yourself, let's have a couple of moments of that, and then we can get straight into the same question.
Yes, well, I'm a recovering politician, recovering from my participation in the Runcorn and Helsby by-election on behalf of the Workers' Party, which was less than a resounding success. But we can come back to that because it's linked to the issues of Gaza and Ukraine. What strikes me generally is how these issues are related for the EU. Because the EU has taken such a strong position critical of Russia, they find themselves in a bind when they see Israel behaving in a much worse way towards civilian populations in Gaza. But the EU has traditionally been soft on Israel. And they're they're now in an exquisite dilemma. Their weak position on Gaza means that they can't speak with authority to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. They're trying to square the circle by toughening up their language on Israel, but their actions belie them. Just recently, 10 out of the 27 members of the EU would not support a proposal to review trade relations with Israel. And review just means review, not necessarily suspend relations or impose any sanctions, but simply review. Even then, it was too much for 10 members of the EU, who almost all happen to be what we could call right-wing. And this is where it gets interesting, because there's a read across from Gaza to the issue of migration. And for many of these right-wingers, including right-wingers in our own country, the Tories and Reform, Israel is doing to Muslims in Gaza what they would love to do to Muslims in this country, but can't. That is what's going on here. And that is why we have something of a divide between the left and the right. I do not include Labour, of course, under the label left. They are, if anything, extreme centrists, and have recently been moving ever more towards the right, with Reform and parties like itself in Europe, whether it's in Germany or Italy or Hungary, is that they're on an anti-Muslim crusade. And therefore, in their eyes, Israel can do no wrong, and beating up on defenseless Muslims in Gaza is just what they like to see.
Of course, and if I could ask you, when you think, how does the EU aid to Palestine, from your perspective, compare with the aid to Ukraine? What are those comparisons from your perspective?
Well, the EU traditionally has been quite supportive of Palestine in terms of providing humanitarian aid. But of course, the aid which has been provided to Gaza is several zeros on the figure, less than aid provided to Ukraine. Aid to Ukraine is counted in billions, aid to the Palestinians in tens of millions, or most recently, I think, a package of 125 million, none of which has actually reached Gaza because of the Israelis, of course, about which the Europeans have done precisely nothing, nor are they likely to do anything. Above all, because of Germany. Germany, because of its long-term indulgence of Israel something which goes back to German complexes about the Holocaust, of course. Germany is the slowest ship in the convoy of the EU, and they will always block any meaningful action. They were one of the 10, of course, who voted against even reviewing trade with Israel. But as I mentioned, they're not alone. They have at least 9 buddies, and even the 17 are not that strong, because they include mostly smaller countries who don't carry very much weight, unfortunately. So the prospect of the EU actually doing something that would upset Netanyahu is absolutely remote, and all their blather, all their strong language is, as the Italians say, parole, parole. It's just words.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter. And can I ask you, Philip, the same question, please? What's your take on the EU, the aid to Palestine compared to the aid to Ukraine from within the EU?
Well, as Peter says, you can count EU aid to Palestine in the tens of millions, and you'd need to turn that into billions when you talk about Ukraine. There just is no comparison. In fact, you could, a good contrast would be EU aid to Palestine compared to its aid to Israel. For example, Germany supplies Israel with atomic submarines at a cut price rate because of the same complex that Peter was referring to earlier, which is an indirect subsidy of worth billions of euros. So in ways, the EU is co-funding this whole genocidal action by Israel currently. And as we all know, in the tortuous days since the so-called Oslo Accords of the early 1990s, there's been a tap that gets turned on and off of aid to the Palestinian Authority for when they behave themselves, and gets turned off when they are regarded as not behaving themselves. It's an excruciating situation, and it's worth thinking about why this is the case. And we know, unfortunately, the position that Israel has managed to carve out for itself in the world doesn't only play on European guilt for things that happened a century ago or whatever, but they've managed to make themselves this indispensable strategic asset of the West in the Middle East. And I think I've seen German politicians describe it as such. So, and in that way, the treatment of Israel for Europe has parallels to how it views its role in Ukraine, and in neither case do peoples like the Palestinians have any say in the matter. In fact, they're a nuisance that are in the way. And as Peter has said, there's a deep-rooted antagonism in European culture to them as Muslims to start with, but also a totally acquiescence to the project that Israel has underway. The constant refrain is, "Do you not accept Israel's right to exist?" That's all very well, but what are Israel's borders? Even although it has, people talk about the sovereignty of borders, Israel consistently refuses to tell us what its borders are. It does not even recognize its own borders, but continues to try to expand them on the basis of some biblical prophecies and so forth.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Philip. People may or may not be aware that the first president of the European Commission, Walter Hallstein, was a member of the Nazi Party. The grandfather of the current EU leader, Ursula von der Leyen, was also an executive of a company that used forced labour under the Nazis. I just wonder what your take on this would be, Peter, when we think about the influence with the EU. Could this influence the EU's hypocritical approach, is the question I'm going to ask, when it comes to Ukraine and Palestine?
Well, we have to say that Germany seems to have a thing about genocide. And I'm thinking not just about the Holocaust and Gaza, but also Namibia. German behavior as the colonial power in Namibia was notorious. And it's no accident that today Namibia is one of the most supportive African countries towards Palestine. They have lived also under the German jackboot. And the EU itself under the German jackboot, because they're the main paymasters, is not allowed to do the decent thing to stop the genocide in Gaza. As Philip mentioned, arms exports are very important. Germany is the second biggest arms exporter to Israel after the United States. And they could play a very important role if they wanted to do so in stopping the genocide, but they won't. The only thing that's happening is that there has been a movement in European popular opinion. There has been a sea change because of social media, and even on some mainstream media, the daily pictures of the atrocities taking place can no longer be brushed aside or ignored. And there has been a sea change, I'm told reliably by observers in Germany, about the way Germans, ordinary Germans, see things. And they see things in much the same way that Europeans elsewhere do, and even in the United States, especially among younger people. And so governments are running scared of public opinion. This is why they're changing their language, but trying to hide their actions.
Thank you, Peter. The same question to you, Philip. Can you remember the question, or do you want me to repeat it?
No, it's okay. Yes, you're talking about the Nazi pasts of various Germans. Yeah, I mean, this is a constant thing. We have to remember at the end of the Second World War, which people should remember is 80 years ago at this stage, something like 9 million out of the 80 million Germans had been members of the party, Nazi party, by the war's end. So I mean, if you like, the entire political class, the business class, the ruling class in general, which didn't change all that much afterwards. There was a bit of shifting of personnel, are compromised in that way. But I suppose one of the things about the EU, and one of the things that was one of its better aspects, I mean, for all its compromises, was that the people who founded it, if you go to the generation of Adenauer and Schuman and de Gaulle and so on, they actually had an idea of bringing countries together, which meant bringing together the people who had just fought the Second World War. So, and that was, there was something noble in that, although the compromise involved were necessarily, not very nice. But there's been that's nowadays that origin history of the EU has type of been forgotten. And the political class in Germany has type of reverted to what it just regards as this type of objective geopolitical interest. And you'll find a lot of people in politics there, they find their grandfathers or whatever were involved in all sorts of very nasty stuff. But does it change what they see? It's a very hard complex to. Do you know the Spiegel magazine? That's a famous left liberal bleeding heart magazine in Germany. And the people who set that up were a bunch of people who were making careers as journalists under the Nazi regime, and woke up on the 8th of May 1945 to realize that the game had changed, and they were taken in hand by British intelligence in Hanover and given this project to set up a type of Western, pro-Western type of soft-centered news magazine. and off they went. So they type of woke up on the 8th of May 1945 and suddenly went, oops, okay, I'm now a passionate Liberal Democrat. And it seems to have been a very easy transition for people to make. And we see this all across Europe. There's something that people don't remember is that there were a lot of resistance movements during the war across Europe, but in not a single country did you see a liberal democratic movement rise to throw out the Germans or throw out the Nazis. A lot of them had armies fighting with the Germans in Russia, trying to in the Soviet Union. And the people the backbone of these resistance movements were communists, were left-wing people of various types, sometimes Catholic groups, but not liberal democratic groups. So this is part of the complex of European history. So does it influence their hypocrisy today? Well, of course it does, because if you like, hypocrisy is at the core of post-war European politics and how the whole project has evolved. And so it comes as second nature and I've seen it being put when you get the argument put about how Ukraine was nearly in the European family in 1918. You might remember after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that Lenin concluded with the Germans to end the war in the East. It included the setting up of a Ukrainian state west of the Dnieper, I should add, where possibly the future Ukrainian state will also end. But so we see the same geopolitical thinking going on, regardless of regime, regardless of generation, over time and space, and very similar to the European attitude of over 200 years towards Russia.
Totally. And of course, the best predictor for future patterns and behaviours is previous ones. Back over to you, Peter, that currently the UN Human Rights Council officer of the Commissioner for Human Rights, the General Assembly, and the ICC and the ICJ have all condemned Israel's actions as war crimes or genocide. Why is the EU, from your perspective, why has the EU not come to the same conclusion?
Well, it's certainly true that the EU has been very reticent, even in its use of language, let alone use of sanctions. It can't bring itself to use the words Israel and condemn in the same sentence. In fact, the record shows that it's only in very recent weeks that it's even been willing to mention Israel at all. It's been speaking as though the atrocities in Gaza were somehow acts of God. Now they have started. They've had no choice but to speak, actually to name the devil, Israel. They've also been very reticent in recognizing the fact of genocide, even though, as Michael, you mentioned, even though international bodies, the UN, ICJ, ICC, others, have accused Israel. But the EU has its head buried in the sand and still refuses to call a spade or a genocide a genocide. I don't see that changing. It's in the European genes. They will be subservient to Israel because they're subservient to Germany. Germany leads the dance, and as we've discussed earlier, there are also European domestic politics at play here, with all the parties of the right siding with Israel. It's striking, even in this country, to read publications of the right, how they are doubling down at the moment on their support for Israel. And I think this is harking back to the Nazification of Europe, the Nazification of Germany that took place in the 1930s. People were in denial about Jews being hawked off to concentration camps, and doubled down by blaming the victims. And this is what we're seeing now on the right. It's a very alarming thing.
Well, I don't think it's any surprise, Peter, that if you say something enough times, it's amazing how people just believe it without questioning it. And that was Goebbels' perspective on it anyway. Philip, the same question to you, please.
Yeah, I think Peter has said it all there. Just what I would add, like, it is interesting that opinion polls across Europe are finding that ordinary people actually share pretty much similar views of what's going on there. I mean, because of the way the media is very skewed, especially in Germany, it's appalling. I do follow it. Um, that there is more and more consensus that what is going on is a live stream genocide in front of people's eyes. But I remember 12 years ago with some colleagues going to the European Parliament to petition their Foreign Affairs Committee, and we actually met the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, and we were petitioning on them at that time on Israel's behaviour, because it was carrying out that grisly term that one Israeli minister called it. They were carrying out a mowing the lawn operation in Gaza, which they did periodically, involving usually a few thousand people killed and a lot of destruction, which is nothing compared, of course, to what's happening now. And we had a document with us where we set out the whole thing in relation to the Israel EU trade agreement and Article 2 of it, which compels both parties to observe international humanitarian law. And you could just not get through to politicians. They had this blank wall. We don't question that. We have an obligation to support Israel, and so forth. And it was just quite incredible. People were prepared to look at small items around the edges, or how the Oslo process could be improved, or this, that, and the other. But the idea of actually ever coming out and implementing the EU's own stated policy, either in relation to Israel or indeed in relation to the two-state solution, which is allegedly their policy. There was just no give on that. I mean, the why, I think we've covered that ground. It's a complex that just has Europe by the throat, and that a wonderful American professor from Chicago, Professor Mersheimer, has been very good at explaining how the same process operates, if anything, at an even worse level in the United States, through the working of the Israeli lobby, which even a lot of Jews in America are very opposed to. But the Israeli lobby is just all powerful, and any politician makes the slightest action that might harm Israel or be critical of it, they can find their careers destroyed very fast.
Totally. And I think when you look at the bigger picture on the box, you would see how that can be made to happen, given the corporatization of all those environments. Philip, when you consider the EU, what's the EU's position from your perspective on the sovereignty of Palestine, and how does it compare with Ukraine on that front?
Yeah. The position of the EU on Palestine is there's the two parts. Palestine was the initial resolution of 1948, by the disastrous resolution, I should say, by the UN General Assembly, which we should always remember only consisted of about 30 states at the time, not the 200 that are now in it, and mostly European and South American states, and a couple of Asians. Was the establishment of two entities, a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. And that was never, it was implemented with regard to one of the parties, but not to the other. And no sooner had it been implemented as regards Israel, that Israel proceeded to grab double the territory that the UN had allocated it, and would later add to that with a similar amount of additional expansions. And nothing was ever done in terms of the Palestinian state. And because of the actions of the Palestinian resistance in the 60s and 70s, and particularly when this came home to bite with the OPEC oil embargoes, that the West finally felt they had to do something, and so they started this. They adopted this at the so-called two-state solution, which is now the official position of the European Union, that they will defend the right of Israel, etc., but they'll also endeavour to bring about the creation of a peaceful, non-threatening Palestinian state alongside Israel. But of course, this has never happened. This was supposed the famous roadmap. I think it was Clinton. The famous roadmap, Oslo roadmap, was supposed to bring this about, and that is now, how long ago is that? That is now 32 years ago, and there's no sign of that. And millions of Palestinians are living basically as people without any rights in an occupied status for nearly 70 years, which is totally in breach of any type of international law. And nothing has been done to bring this Palestinian state about, and I don't think there's any intention of ever doing so. Because it's always qualified that any such state cannot be a threat to Israel. And when that's pushed, well, what does that mean? It means they can't have an army, or they can't have security institutions that that might displease Israel and so forth. So, and with the form of the settlement strategy of the Israelis since Oslo, nearly at this stage, it's very nearly 1 million people they've settled into the West Bank and Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and you name it. And it's all, the dreadful situations all parcelled out with apartheid walls and roads that only Jews can drive on, all this. That how you make a contiguous state out of that is, you'd need a Houdini. So it's obvious that this is just not serious on the part of the West, either the EU or the United States. So,
The same question to you, Peter, if I may. What is the EU's position on sovereignty in Palestine, and how does it compare with the Ukraine?
Can I just say first, if I can jump in, that I personally, and this is not the party position, but my personal position, I hate it when they talk about two states.
Yeah.
I hate it when they talk about recognition of a Palestinian state, because it's a substitute. It's a substitute for real action. It's a substitute for calling for the end of occupation. This is what we all, I think, want. The end of the occupation. Use those words. Make it happen. Be ready to impose sanctions if Israel does not end the occupation. All the rest is just baloney, hot air. And you can, when people like Starmer express support for the two-state solution, you can almost read the caption underneath. You fools, you're going to believe me on this, but it's just hot air. I'm not going to do anything about it. And Israel, this is just water off a duck's back. And for me personally, the whole campaign for Palestine to be recognized is just a substitute for real action. And I don't support it very much. I understand why some people do. They have the best intentions. Many Palestinians would be gratified by recognition of the state, but tactically, I think it's being shunted. The Palestinian cause being shunted into a siding. It is never going to reach the destination. Sorry, what was the question?
Thank you. Peter, at this moment in time, the European ministers seem to be putting some distance in between themselves and Israel lately. Britain, France and Canada have criticised Israel's expansion of the war in Gaza and described the humanitarian situation as, quote, intolerable. Are we witnessing a genuine change of heart amongst Europeans towards the plight of Palestinians? Is that what you believe might be going on? Or from your perspective, what else might be going on?
Yeah, the basic sad truth is that for Europe, Israel is an extension of itself. This is why they welcome Israel into Eurovision and the European sporting competitions. Israelis are sort of Europeans. They're like us, aren't they? They're mostly kind of white, and they keep down the Muslims. They are Europeans as Europeans, many of them, would like to be. And they see a stereotype of Israel as a brave country facing hordes of Asiatic migrants. This is the sad racial truth behind everything that's going on. And I'm afraid it's coming closer to the surface. Gaza is bringing out the worst instincts of Europe and especially of the European right.
The same question to you, please, Philip.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with what Peter's saying there, of course. And I mean, Israel, people tend to get wrapped up in the Jewish aspect of it, but it's also, as Peter says, a European project. It's a settler colonial entity. I mean, it existed before it became a state. It existed as an entity, as an extension of the British Empire. The people who set it up, Herzl, these original Weizmann, the original people of the World Zionist Council, specifically sought to be established as a homeland, as a protectorate of the British Empire, and they offered them that their role would be a British governor in Palestine in the 1920s described it as, "We will create here a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism." Now, what has changed since? What has changed what has changed in the European conceptualization or mentality since? That corresponds exactly to what Peter was saying in terms of people now relating it to the hordes of migrants and so forth. And so the Zionists offered themselves to the British at the time that they would be a white, loyal imperial entity there that would serve the interests of Britain, which was creating a land link to the Indian Empire and so on, amongst this hostile sea of Arabism. So what more needs to be said? That is the case. And you asked earlier, Michael, which I actually forgot to respond to, was how these European attitudes to Palestinian sovereignty differ from their attitude to Ukrainian sovereignty. Well, of course, there's this constant bleeding of the what you call the sovereignty of sovereign borders and their integrity, but they forget another bit of the UN Charter, which is about the rights of people to self-determination. And when Ukraine began to be morphed into something which it hadn't been in the 1990s, into something very nasty indeed from the point of view of the huge Russian-speaking minorities in the East, then at that stage, the right of self-determination takes precedence over borders drawn in sand and the imposition of rule by one group upon the other. And we can see in the Palestine situation that there's no intention by the West to, they give lip service to the so-called international borders of 1967. In fact, more than lip service, it's actually in their policy that this is to be, that the border of Israel are those borders of 1967, borders which Israel has grossly overstretched right over them long since, and not a peep is heard from the ever so morally upright Europeans.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the Financial Times reported the bitterness between Israel and Europe, and this burst into the open after the murder of 2 Israeli embassy staff in Washington last week. The Israeli foreign minister accused the Europeans of anti-Semitic incitement. No matter what the killings that took place in the US, it was the Europeans who got the blame. Netanyahu weighed in. He also accused the UK and France of siding with the murderers, rapists, baby killers, and kidnappers, which I can just see as a certain spin anyway. Why are the US, from your perspective, Philip, why are the US and Israel attacking the Europeans over that incident?
Why are they attacking the Europeans? Well, I think I think the Israelis are attacking the Europeans because the Europeans are on the defensive in relation to the US at the moment. And they also know they've nothing to fear from the Europeans. If Netanyahu tells them they're being anti-Semitic, they'll come running. Oh, please, no, don't say we're being anti-Semitic, anything but that. And it's an interesting thing in the political upheaval in Europe nowadays that all these so-called extreme right-wing parties that are emerging, they're even more fanatically pro-Israel than the mainstream parties have been. And like, how do you explain that? There's some very strange psychology going on there. But the accusations of anti-Semitism, I mean, they're just, it's at the, I wonder about young people. I mean, I'm certainly still, I was born the late 1950s, so I was still born in the afterwash of the Second World War. It was something we were all very conscious of growing up. But I can't imagine young people today can really, these accusations of anti-Semitism and that another Holocaust was starting, I can't believe that they can really grasp that this is really going to have a major effect on them. They're what they see is what's happening before their eyes, and they're judging the reality of that. They'll judge events on the base reality of that. I mean, Netanyahu says mass murderers and rapists and baby killers. I mean, this all goes back to the narrative that they spun the day after the 7th of October events in 2023, a lot of which have been, the stuff about mass rapes and burning babies. It's all been proved to, none of it happened, you know. But why? I don't know if the US is attacking. I mean, the US is attacking Europe because it's trying to leave our trade advantage with it at the moment, and it's trying to dump the catastrophe of the Biden administration's Ukraine strategy in the lap of the EU. So any stick to beat the Europeans is good at the moment, and believe you me, they deserve every beating of the stick they get, because their complicity in what's happening in Ukraine is just extraordinary. I mean, where's a Bismarck when we need one? You know, who said the first principle of a good foreign policy is a treaty with Russia? You know.
And do you think, Philip, that the genocide in Palestine could mark the end for Netanyahu?
I don't think it matters. I don't. It may lead to his end. I mean, who can tell? I mean, and like so much else in the world, it's extraordinary how much hangs on what one man does next, and that is Donald Trump. If he got up in the morning and said, "I'm turning off the tap of military supplies to Israel," the whole thing would collapse. This whole campaign, Netanyahu's whole strategy, the whole lot would collapse overnight. Now, whether Trump can do such a thing in the given the nature of American politics is probably doubtful, but we are living in a world where when we wake up in the morning, the first thing we want to know is, did Donald send out any tweets since I went to bed that may be of world historic importance? Like, we are in that situation, so it's very hard to forecast. But one thing I would say is that at the height of these events, and even before them, when Netanyahu had some type of project to bring the courts in Israel to heel under more political control, there was a big liberal movement against him to protect the judiciary and so on. But the opposition to Netanyahu is still at that level. It's over things like the judiciary and so on. There's no opposition to what he's doing in Israel. There's some demonstrations take place where the hostages just want the hostages to be brought back, and that whatever strategy he's pursuing should be prioritized. But the head of the opposition, who's Bennett, is it? And previous Israeli prime minister came out, I think yesterday, Omert, to actually say what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza has reached a point of massive war crimes and crimes against humanity. But that's the first breach. The head of the opposition has no opposition on principle to the operation in Gaza, only some quibbles about how aspects of how it's being implemented. And the same with previous prime ministers who have spoken. So even if Netanyahu went, that would not change the trajectory of Israel's development, which has been in a very singular direction for 70 years.
Thank you. Peter, the two same questions to you. Why are the US and Israel attacking the Europeans over the incident that took place? And also, the second question, do you think the genocide in Palestine could mark the end for Netanyahu?
Well, I suspect that in Trump's mind, the two issues, Gaza and Ukraine, are linked in the sense that they affect American domestic politics. What Trump has been trying to do with Russia, not very successfully, but trying anyway, which is something really quite brave. And it's involved confronting the American right, which has traditionally been very anti-Russian. And to take the Republican right with him, I suspect he has had to double down on his already tremendous support for Israel, and made it more difficult for him to fight on two fronts. Already he's struggled to take the right with him over Ukraine and Russia. Had he thrown Israel under the bus as well, as it would have been characterized, then he would have lost on all fronts. But I suspect that Trump himself doesn't care much for Israel and probably loathes Netanyahu. But domestic politics can't be ignored. And one thing I learned in my Foreign Office career was that basically all foreign international politics are domestic politics. You have to carry public opinion with you, or at least you have to be ready to win in your domestic political forum. So that's one of the things that's going on here, I think. Netanyahu, surely his days are numbered. The domestic opposition to him, not to what he's doing to Palestinians, but what he's doing to Israeli interests, the way he's clearly putting his personal concerns and ambitions before the issue of hostages. At the end,
Finally, our last question. Philip, from your perspective, do you believe that the European leaders, will they go unpunished for their collaboration in what are clearly war crimes?
In Gaza, yeah. Of course they'll go unpunished. There is no punishment for friends of Israel anywhere in the world, and whether there ever will be, I just do not see how that will be. There was one thing which I did in your previous question, Michael, about the attacking Europeans over the two U.S. embassy officials who were killed. What that shows, the Israel thing shows that the one weapon they feel they still have that can really shift or keep the Europeans and Americans in line is this accusation of anti-Semitism and accusation of playing to an anti-Semitic playbook, because they didn't quite attack the Europeans over the incident, but they said what they basically said is that the type of criticisms now being vaguely voiced by European leaders, incited that individual to carry out that attack, and that this what happens when you let your guard down on anti-Semitism. They still regard it as a huge lever in Western society, this accusation. But as a real sign of weakness is how they really feel they have to shore this up by law in Western countries. There's the so-called international, what is it called? International Holocaust Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which allows for criticism of Israel, but does not allow for any comparison of it with Nazi crimes or any comparison of or any questioning of the right of Israel to exist. And the fact that they feel they need to get this type of thing into Western European laws is a sign of weakness, in my view. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's young people growing up now don't understand what they mean by anti-Semitism. We do of a previous generation or historically, but that just doesn't exist in any real sense in the Western world nowadays. But will the European leaders go unpunished? Of course they'll go unpunished. I think it's much more important to focus on the type of thing Peter was saying, that move the compass on what the debate is here, move it to the occupation, to the illegal colonial settlements of Palestinian territory, to the Israel goes on and its supporters go on about its right as a state to exist, but Israel does not accept the right of any of the states around it to exist, and has carried out wars and had the West carry out the destruction of 7 of those states in the last 20 years. So it is really important that we really focus on the occupation, on the illegal settlement and expropriation of Palestinian land and so forth. But to hope that someday European leaders will stand charges for their role in aiding and abetting these crimes, I think unfortunately we shouldn't expend energy on chasing that, because that will never happen, I don't think.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Philip, and unfortunately, I think we've lost Peter for the moment. So thank you, Philip, for the very informative evening. I love listening to people like yourselves, because it's clear that you're well read and you've taken a look at history, and I think that's fundamental to measuring what's going on right now, because anything can be distorted in the moment. And me, being ex-military, also know that a psychological operation is always in place when you want people to believe a certain thing and a certain narrative. And I think it's also worth mentioning for a moment that, from my understanding, Zionism is not a religion, it is a political agenda. And so it's the Zionists that have constantly called out and used the term anti-Semite, because any organization or any group of people, any population that are reasonable and understanding and quite evolved in terms of their humanity don't ever want to be labeled with a label like that. And of course, it's those types of people that are the easiest to manipulate. And Zionism is a political agenda. It has tentacles everywhere. I remember Liz Truss, when she became prime minister, she said to the conservative friends of Israel, I'm a big Zionist. Now, I don't know what that means and what that equals, but I've got a rough idea, because I have the capacity, like you, Philip, to read and to look outside of the box. And my perspective on this is that if your television is more influential than your library, then we're going to have some challenges along the way. So, Philip, thank you so much for being tonight. I will thank Peter personally via email. It's been very, very informative. And that is the end of our broadcast for tonight. And I look forward to the next broadcast with our future guests. From me, Mick Stott, I would like to say good night and see you next week.